from Panama. Today we're going to talk about communication. Even though communication is something we do all the time and basically take for granted, it's really pretty phenomenal how it works. The idea that I can say something and put thoughts into your head and you understand what I mean is pretty remarkable. It means there must be something that we share. But what exactly is this? The short answer, of course, is that we share language. But of course, language is incredibly complex. So let's take some time to examine how it works and when it doesn't. When we think about language or communication, we can break it up into the components, what it is, and the conventions, how we use it. The components of language, or the building blocks, include things like pronunciation or phonetics, words, slang, jargon, or lexicon, and grammar or syntax. In addition to language, there are nonverbal components that carry meaning as well. Eye contact, posture, gestures, personal space, and even silence. Each of these components has choices. We have a range of pitch, tone, we have synonyms or different word choices, and we have different grammatical structures we can use. The second piece, the conventions, refers to how and when we use language. The setting, the context, the interactants, and the purpose all play a role in the choices we make. On their own, each of these carry meaning. And then we put them together in infinite ways to create sentences, dialogue, instructions, etc. And as complex individuals in complex societies, we rely on this range of choices to create complex ideas. Of course, we also rely on the other person to have the same set of shared meanings for each of these components in order for our message, our intentions to be communicated. So communication works like this. I pick the tone, the words, the grammar, the pronunciation, consider the setting and the participants, and tons of other small factors to put forward not just an idea, but a whole message, which considers the relationship, other dynamics, previous interactions, and the resulting action I want. If you share the same meaning for all of these components and conventions, then our communication is successful. Sounds pretty easy, right? Of course it isn't. Even when we have a lot in common, we misunderstand one another. Our diversity of experiences, our personalities, our cultures, and other factors lead to differences in interpretations and expectations. Just like the small but noticeable differences in scenery throughout this video, small differences in expectations can lead to subtle but important differences in understanding. The problem is further intensified because language, like culture, is taught to us so early on and so completely ingrained that we don't consciously recognize that we may have different interpretations for the components and the conventions that others have. We think the way we understood something is the way it was meant. We think the way we say something is the way it will be interpreted. In other words, we think meaning is universal. So what do we need to do to gain intercultural competence for our communication skills? As I've said before, we need to practice mindfulness. And we need to learn to interrupt our cultural scripts. One way to do this is to dissect communication into those components and conventions that we've been talking about. So when you feel frustrated, irritated, or confused by an interaction, stop and take a moment to look at your cultural scripts. Avoid negatively judging the other person as rude. Look more objectively at the components and the conventions that they've used. When you have the judgment of someone being rude, think about what led you to that assumption. Was it the volume of their voice? Was it the grammatical choice, being direct or indirect? Was it the word choices? Were they formal, informal? Think about what those different components mean to you. Do you interpret loudness to mean rudeness? Do you interpret directness to be in order? Do you interpret formal language to be unfriendly? Finally, acknowledge that the meaning they intended with these components may not be the meaning that you interpret it. A handy way to dissect communication is to think about what they mean. Mean stands for M, or moves. How does the communication move forward? Who initiates it? How does turn-taking work? Are there interruptions or silence? E, word and grammatical elements. What are the choices made when it comes to the words and the grammar? What do these choices convey to you? Do they convey friendliness or unfriendliness? Closeness or distance? Formality or informality? A, audibles. What do the pitch, tone, and pronunciation signal to you? Does it convey an order or a question? Friendliness or unfriendliness? And finally, nonverbals. What do the gestures, eye contact, and body posture convey to you? Now, consider for each of these elements, the other person may have a different intention. And when you look at each of these, you want to consider a variety of factors that influence the choice made. Sometimes there are cultural differences. Sometimes there are personality differences. But even with cultural differences, we need to think in nuanced ways. When we think about why we make the choices we do with our language, it can be helpful to look at this grid showing two different aspects of our relationships with people: power and distance. Power refers to whether there is a power dynamic that we want to acknowledge, such as whether one person is more powerful or whether the two people are more equal. Distance refers to how close we feel to someone, to how well we know someone. In the U.S., we tend to use formal language when we are in an unequal relationship, or at least the person with less power uses more formal language. We also use formal language when we are distant to someone, when we don't feel close to them. We tend to use informal language and are more talkative when we are in an equal relationship or when we feel close to someone. There's someone we know well. Of course, there is room for adjustments, and we use a mixture of these all the time. For example, on an elevator with someone that we don't know, we might use informal language to signal that there is no hierarchy between us, but not be very talkative because we're not close to them, they're a stranger. Or with a leader who we know well, we might use formal titles to display hierarchy, but a lot of chit-chat to show closeness. So let's turn to how this might look in a cross-cultural setting and apply our "what do they mean?" For example, in the U.S., we might say we are pretty talkative with people we know, but in business settings, we don't actually spend a lot of time chit-chatting. It's more typical to exchange a few pleasantries and then get down to business. However, we are likely to address one another by first names because we tend to not like hierarchy. In Panama, in business settings, you would more likely see the use of titles, which signals hierarchy, but also a lot of conversation, which signals closeness. So to dissect this in a very small way, we can use "what do they mean?" Moves. In Panama, conversation in a business setting will likely flow with lots of questions about one another. In the U.S., this often feels invasive, while in Panama, it signals that the business associates know each other well. Elements. In Panama, there is likely the use of titles to signal hierarchy, which for the U.S. generally bristles our sense of equality and our preference for informality. In Panama, this hierarchy is expected. Audibles. Instead of pointing at something with their fingers, Panamanians often make a kissing sound to point to something. Nonverbals. In Panama, there might be closer proximity to one another. There might also be kisses on the cheek to greet one another. In the U.S., we tend to have a larger space in between one another and generally use handshakes. It's important to recognize that even though these differences convey things like formality or distance, informality, friendliness, they're both polite, just different. How we signal politeness depends on a variety of factors: the context, the interactants, and the cultural norms. But it's important to respect that people are generally polite, even though politeness looks different. I hope this has been helpful in giving you some ideas about how communication can go wrong and what you can do to better interculturally communicate. In learning more about the intentions that are sent and the interpretations that are received, you can adjust your communication to be more appropriate and effective.